Welcome to Build a SaaS with React, a premium course that shows you step-by-step how to build your own online business made entirely with React. This project will give you everything you need to start selling products online. We'll learn the ins and outs of building dynamic websites with Next.js, designing a user interface with React, accepting subscription payments with Stripe, managing app data and authentication with Supabase, and tons more. By the end, you'll have a production-ready project ready to share with the world. This course is for anyone who wants to learn how to build truly epic apps with React, and you can start making them right now. Just click the link below and let's dive in. To create our project, I would recommend that you install and use VSCode as your code editor. It's what I'll be using, and I'll show you a bunch of different tips and tricks on using VSCode more effectively. You need Node.js installed on your computer, so I would recommend installing the long-term support version of Node. When you install Node, it comes with npm, which we'll be using to install our dependencies and run our project. And you'll also need Git installed. Git will be less important for version control, although it's very helpful in that regard, but we'll be using Git primarily for deploying our project to set up a continuous deployment pipeline with Vercel so that whenever we make changes to our code, it's immediately pushed to production. So with all that, once you have all those things installed, you can click the link below this video to grab the starting code for our project and then drag it into VS Code or your editor of choice. It should look something like this. From there, we can install all of our dependencies by opening our terminal. You can go to View Terminal or use the shortcut listed here. And from there, we'll run npm I. Now that we've got all of our dependencies installed and we're ready to start coding, there are some extensions that we can add to VS Code that will make our coding experience a lot more productive. The first one, and I've included all of these in the VS Code folder. When you open your project, you may have had a recommendation about some recommended extension to install. The first recommendation I've included is Prettier, which is a code formatter. So if we have some code that's not formatted correctly, we can use Prettier to just save, and Prettier will take care of formatting it and making it look nice. You can install Prettier manually by going to View and then Extensions, and then typing in the name Prettier. Should be the first result, and you can hit install here. The next extension comes built into VS Code, and that is Emmet. Emmet's really helpful in allowing us to more quickly make our user interfaces. For example, when building out a component, we can create an element just by adding its opening tag. It'll expand it and create its closing tag automatically. This works for every element you can think of. And Emmet also comes with some really convenient shortcuts. For example, if we wanted to create a div with a class, we could say dot and then the class name and then hit tab to expand it. And we can create some really sophisticated structures just by chaining these different Emmet shortcuts. To make sure that Emmet works within our JavaScript files and we can use it with JSX, you're going to need to go to Code, Settings, and search for Emmet. Go to Include Languages and make sure you've added the item JavaScript with the value JavaScript React. I'm using the material theme. You can go to View, Extensions, and then search for that as well to install it. To change our theme, we can go to View and then open the command palette and search for color theme. From there, you can choose whichever themes that you have installed. I'm using the material theme Ocean High Contrast, and I'm also using the font Operator Mono. Now that we have all of our dependencies installed, we can run our project with npm run dev, and this should start up a development server on localhost 3000. If we open it up, we shouldn't see anything. Right now we have some applied styles coming from, if we go into the source folder where all of our source code exists, all of our styles are coming from source, styles, globals.css. The only thing that I've done for you ahead of time is writing all of these styles, the styles that we'll need for our app, and also creating a bunch of empty components and pages and API routes so that you don't have to create them manually. But other than that, I've done nothing else in creating this project. We're going to be making it from scratch. And where we're going to start from is the index page. So within source, we have a bunch of different folders. Core is for kind of all of the shared components and stuff that we need. We have some folders here that correspond to the different types of pages that we have. We have login for the login page. We have pricing for the pricing page. And products is all products related stuff. So within pages, we can see all of the different routes that we have within our app. Here we can see we have our homepage component. And in Next.js, that's all you have to do in order to make a page is just give a JavaScript file a name within pages. To make the homepage the index page, we just give it the name index. And then we can include some content. We can return some JSX. We can return a div with the text test. And if we look at localhost 3000, we can see that was updated to be displayed in our page. We're going to begin by designing a simple user interface where on one side, we're going to have a title and link to our products, and then on the other side, we're just going to have a big hero image. So as I mentioned, we'll be using Emmet, and we'll start by creating a div with the class name grid_halves and the class hScreenNavBar. We can take a look at what that looks like. We're going to have our text content on this side and our image on the other side. So we're dividing it into halves. The first half is going to be another div with the background teal, so it'll be class BGTeal, and then border right. And we can use the greater than, or the angle bracket here, in order to add a child to this div. So we can, after that, add another div with the class name column padding to give this teal box some padding, and then another class within it for tablets with the class tablet centered to center all the content. And then within that, another div with the classes content grid and home hero. So now we have a teal box on the left and a white one on the right. Let's add a title up at the top. We'll use an H1 and we'll say the most, and then add a line break, epic products, since we're going to be selling products of some sort with our SaaS. And then we're going to have a paragraph underneath it with the class section subtitle. So this is our subtitle. Again, you can make the content whatever you like, but since this is going to be based around products as a SaaS, I'm going to give mine the content by using some curly brackets. I'll give it the content, text content, all the most epic things on the internet, all in one place. We can expand that. Then underneath, we'll have our button that will allow users to explore products. So this will be a link to our products page. But instead of having it be just a normal set of anchor tags, we'll add a link, and we can add a custom. We can still use Emmet and use a component, as in this case, by just giving the name, providing the name of the component, and then adding, class name. In our case, it'll be large button. So components do work with Emmet as well. And we want to give it an href like we would a normal set of anchor tags. We'll give it the href products. Now, link needs to be imported. And so if we just retype the last character, we can get a suggestion to auto import link from next/link. And within our button, we'll include a div, and we can use an abbreviation to give it the class name large button text with the text content explore products. Great. And now let's move over to the right side, the right half here, and underneath, as I should say, as a sibling of our div with the class BGTeal, we're going to add a div with the class BGSalmon, and it's going to have a child with the classes column padding and centered. This will have a child div, the class name callout wrap, and within it will be an image, but once again, this is going to be a custom component from Next.js. This is going to be image spelled out like this, because this is coming from next/image. It's a custom image component, and we're going to give it the class name callout image. And we can expand all that. And of course, we could use a regular image here, but we'll see the benefit of using a special next image. Right now we just need to give it a source, and the content is going to come from the public folder. So all of our assets, all of the different images and media that we're going to be using, that's going to come from public/assets. You can find it all here. So we'll begin whenever we write a local path, when we're writing a source or referencing the public folder. If we're not importing it, we just start with slash, as if we're starting in the public folder, and then add the subfolder if we have one. So we say /assets/ and we're going to be using the hero PNG file. Now we need to import this, otherwise we're going to get an error. So we want to import that from next/image, but you'll see here that we're missing the width property. I'm going to turn this into a normal image just for a second so we can see the difference between a regular image, which you can see displayed here, and a next image. So we have that imported, but what next image wants, if we're importing it like this, is it wants us to specify a given height and width. That's required. And the purpose of the image, purpose of next image, and if we take a look at the README file, we can see additional documentation. I've included a bunch of links, a bunch of helpful links that'll give you documentation on things like the image that we'll cover. If we go to that, we're able to see the benefit of using next image. It gives us stuff like browser native lazy loading. It also gives us a blur up placeholder if the image is loading. It provides something in the image's place if the image is still loading, if we have a big image like this one. So next image can help us a lot in preventing things like layout shift or just the annoying nature of images loading in. But what's important to note is that when we're providing a source, if we provide a path, a local path, we're going to need to add a width and a height. However, we can avoid this by importing it just like we would any JavaScript import. So we can use the import syntax to actually import things from our public folder, and we'll give this the name hero. We want to import hero, the hero image from, and we need to specify, we need to go a couple levels up since we're in the pages directory. We need to go 1, 2 levels up to go then into public, into assets, and then to grab hero.png. And now we can use this reference instead of the file path and pass it in as source. Now the reason that that's not working is because we need to make sure that we're using a next image again, and now it works without having to specify a height or a width. And we get all of the benefits of next image, such as, adding a placeholder to have it blur in if it takes some time for the image to load. So it's a very performant way to load our images that we'll be using throughout the course of building our app. Within our app, we want to add a common layout, and the benefit of this is that we can have things like a nav bar across all of our different pages. We can add some meta tags, some meta information, so we see something other than just localhost 3000. So to do that, we can head to our core folder and source core. You can see that there's a layouts folder here, and I have an app layout. And this is something that needs to be wrapped around our entire component tree. If you want to do something like that, if you want to have a shared common layout, you're going to want to head to Pages and App. So app is what renders our everything in our app here with this component that it's getting from props, as well as any props that that component has. And to add a layout here, what we can do is we can take this app layout and we can have it accept the shared component as children. And layout can just use a fragment and accept its children, but above it we can include our navbar component. So we want to import navbar as another core component. You can see that in the components folder. You can import that above our children, and we can also add a meta, the core meta component. And I've already filled a little bit of that out. Feel free to add whatever meta tags that you like. If you want to add a favicon, if you want to add a bunch of additional meta information here, images, whatever you like. So we have these two components added, and we want included within every page in our app. So now we can head to the app the underscore app page and pages, and we can simply add a set of parentheses and import not app, but app layout from source core layouts app and pass component in between the opening and closing tags. That's what allows it to be accepted on this children prop, which is built into React. So now if we head back, we don't see anything yet. However, we want to build out our navbar component. If we had something in navbar, again, we'll add test. You can see it up here. For now, navbar is going to be a pretty simple component. We'll reset this, and we want to return a div with the classes nav container, a class border b2, so add border to the bottom, and border black, those three classes. It'll have within it as its first element a link, so once again we'll make sure to use next link, and this is going to be to the home page. The link is going to use our logo, a custom logo that I've made for this app with our name Epic Saas. So that's going to be there on the left-hand side. And then after that, we want to include some menu items, prompting our user to go to the different pages in our Saas app. So we're going to have a div with the class nav menu, and it's going to include two children, a link with the classes nav link and the class white, and a sibling, which is another link with the classes nav link black. You can expand that, and we need to make sure that we add an href. The first link is going to have the href login, so it's going to have as its children a div with the text login. And for our second link, that's going to be a link to the pricing page, and it's going to have another child div, this time with the text pricing. So now we have a shared layout across all of our pages. We'll see how to exclude pages in the future, but for right now they're across all of our different pages. We have some meta information from our meta component, and we're ready to move on to the products page. Now we'll move on to the products page so that when users click this link, they'll be taken to /products, and they'll be able to see all of the available products that we have in our app. Now, right now, we're going to start with just the user interface. We'll touch on the data and how we're going to get it in just a bit. But for this page, we're going to have a title with the text, the latest products, just announcing that this is our products page, and you can see all of the available stuff beneath it. And we're going to have some cards. We're going to have an array of cards that displays a bunch of components here, where you can see, for example, the cover image for each of these products, the name of them, what category of product they are, etc. And these will be links to go to their individual product page. So let's head to the Pages folder, and we'll find in there a Products folder. What's important to note about creating routes in Next.js is that, as we saw, creating a route is as simple as dropping a page in here. It really doesn't require any work. To create a dynamic route, or to create a route with the same starting path, in this case products, to have it start with products, we can include a folder. So this folder can have its own index page, which matches for just /products. And if we wanted another fixed route, such as about, we could create that, and that would map to, if we were to create this quickly, if we just had the text about, that would map to /products/about. And to match for a dynamic route, if you don't know, or if the value is just different, if you don't know what the value is going to be ahead of time, or maybe it's stored in your database, you can include a dynamic route here by adding a set of brackets around the name. So we'll remove our about page here, and our individual product page has this dynamic route where the path that follows here has the name slug. We'll see why in a little bit, but for example, this will match for literally any value that we include. So we could return the text product here. It's always going to match no matter what we include in here, unless it's just the index page, just the /products page. If it's anything other than that, it's going to display the text product. But if we want to get the slug itself, or what, it doesn't matter, we could give it whatever name that we like, we could use the built-in Next router, and specifically the useRouter hook, which we can put in a variable of the same name, router, we can grab the slug value, that dynamic value, from router.query. And if we log that, we can see that we have an object with the property slug. So we can display the slug's content, and you can see the significance of this. We can use this, for example, if this was an ID, or in our case, a slug for the product, such as my product, we could use that to query our database based off of that value, and that value would come from router.query.slug. So now that's being output on the page. But for now, we'll delete all this, and we just want to go and build out our products page. That's being displayed with the index.js file. We'll add a fragment. We'll make sure to return a fragment. And first we're going to have a section, so we'll have a div with the class section, and we'll have the background blue, so we'll give it the class BG blue as well. It'll have a child with the class container, and then that will have a child with the class name section intro, which will then have an h1 as its child with the text the latest products. We can expand that. This was my mistake. This should be a div. Forgot to add the period here. A div with the class section intro. So now that we have our header up at the top, underneath this section, we're going to add a section, a div with the class section and the class small, to contain all of our product cards. That will have a child with the class container div. Once again, that will contain an unordered list. So we'll include all of our products as list items. And this will have the class product card grid. We'll expand that. And we don't have those products just yet. This white area is where all those products will be displayed. But now we're going to jump into where our products are going to come from, where that data is going to come from, how we're going to manage it, and essentially what is going to run our entire Saas app. To actually manage our product data so that we can display it within our page, the service that we're going to be using for managing our product data, as well as all the data within our app, is Supabase. Supabase is really great because it's an open source service, unlike Firebase. It provides all the functionality that you would expect in a database as a service like Firebase. It'll do essentially everything for you that you need a backend to do without having to build one. It gives you a Postgres database, authentication, APIs, edge functions, real-time data with subscriptions, storage for storing media. Anything your app needs, it has. And the benefit of it being open source is that it can be hosted yourself, so you don't have to worry about vendor lock-in. Plus, it's really affordable. This isn't going to cost us a dime to run, and I found in most cases you really don't need to pay for a Supabase instance unless you want it to be running all the time, or want some additional features like making sure that you have backups of your database. To get started with Supabase, you can just select Start Your Project up at the top if you don't already have an account with them. And once you've signed up, you'll be prompted to create a new project. You'll create a name for your project and give your database a password that you're going to want to remember. You can hit Generate a Password. Pick a region that's closest to you and where your users will likely be. And we can choose the free pricing plan. When your project is being set up, you'll be given your API keys. So these can be added to our env file. If we go to our project and go to a file called env-local, this should actually be .env.local. It was just written like that to make sure that it wasn't ignored. You can see all of the different environment variables that we have here, the important values that we need for our app to run. And you'll see all of the Supabase ones that we need right here. The first one is the Supabase URL. You can grab that from the project configuration section URL. And if you're navigated away from that, you can just hit the project settings option and then go to, and if you're navigated away, if your project's set up and you're navigated away from those values, you can just hit the gear icon, go to project settings, and then go to API. You'll see your project URL here, and you can add that to next public Supabase URL. We also need the anon key, so this is the anon public key. You can copy that. These can be exposed on the client, and public environment variables are prefixed with next public. If they're not, these are restricted to a server-side only environment. The last API key that we need from Supabase is the service role key. We want to reveal that and then hit copy and then add that to Supabase service role key here. Now going back to our original question, the original concern about how data is going to be managed, that's going to be done through Supabase's Postgres database. So Supabase is built off of Postgres SQL. It's a flavor of SQL, and unlike Firebase, if you know SQL well, which is it's not required for this course, but the benefit to knowing SQL is that it allows you to do powerful things with Supabase, unlike something which is proprietary like Firebase. To work with our database, we can go to the table editor. Right now we're looking at the public schema, so these are all the different tables that we've created. The first one that we're going to create is our product table. So we'll select create a new table, we'll give it a name product, we can give it a description if we like, and we want to not check for now row level security. So this means everybody has read and write access. This is fine during development. We'll see how to lock down our database at the end of building our app. But for now, what's important is these columns. This is where we describe what our table should have. What should each product have? What fields or columns should they have? We can specify exactly what their name is, their type, their default value, and the relationships that they have between different tables. For us, I've laid out the tables and the different columns that they consist of in this text file. It's not SQL, but it provides a good idea of what is going to be included here in our product. Of course, you can modify this to fit your needs. But generally, we're going to have a name, a slug, a description, category, and we'll touch on the product content ID a little bit later when we get to protected content. But for now, these 4 fields should suffice. We're going to have a name column first, so each product is going to have a name, and it's going to have the type text. So there's a bunch of different options here for the different data types that Postgres allows us to use. We're going to be using text. And the default value for this is null. It would make sense here to not have the default value be null. We probably want our product to have a name. So we can click the gear icon and remove that is nullable option. We can do the same for slug. Can add a column name with value slug. It'll have the type text. It will not be nullable as well. And for description, we may want to have it be nullable. We'll add that, again, make it the type text. We'll leave is nullable set to true, have that checked. And then category, we might want to have that required again. It's totally up to you. But this is just how I've built my version of the Saas app. Once we've got all of that, we can hit save. Keep in mind that we don't need to make this real time. These are probably products that we're going to do very little with. We can change it over time, but it doesn't need to be updated a great deal. And to insert data, we would insert a row. So that would allow us to make a new product. And here we have another convenient interface to make our product name, our slug, category, description, etc. Now, I've created some dummy products here. You can find them within this product.sql file. You can certainly input these separately, but to show you the power of what we can do with Supabase and the benefit of knowing SQL, if you want to learn SQL or if you know it already, we can go to the SQL editor. And it gives us a bunch of different options, a bunch of different pre-written scripts that we can run. You can see how a bunch of these might be useful. For us, we're going to create a new query. And using this SQL here, we can insert some rows into the table that we just made, our product table. So again, this is public. The product table is a table with the columns name, slug, description, and category. And using values, we can insert in order the name listed here, the slug, the description, and then finally the category. similar to if we were calling a function in JavaScript. So we can just copy all of this, paste it in, and we can either use the shortcut command enter or hit run, and we see success, no rows returned. And if we go to our table editor, this also allows us to see all of our data here. We can select product and we see our first 3 products created with all of the corresponding data that we wrote in the seed command. Now that we have product data in our database, let's see how to use Supabase within our app to display all of our product data within the products page. What's really convenient about Supabase is that if we go to API docs, this tab right here, you'll learn exactly how to work with Supabase on the client and also how to interact with our specific tables. So because we created a public table called product, now we can see a bunch of examples on how to select different properties using the Supabase client. This is a really helpful resource to refer to. We'll take a look at this in just a second, but first let's get started and see how to create a client. Now, by default, when you create a client, you import a function from the Supabase.js package, and you provide a URL and a key. If we head back to our env file, you'll see that we have an anon key and a service role key. You can create a client with either the anon key or the service role key, but what's important to keep in mind is that you can use the anon key in the client. However, the Supabase service role key is something that should only be used on the server. This is what we're going to be using, specifically because we're going to be using it only in a server context. So we're going to head to the pages directory, go to products, and head to index. And we're going to, if we head to the README file, we're going to be using a specific function that's built into Next.js called getStaticProps. This is the signature of the function. And what it does is, this is a function that's going to run on the server. It's going to run at build time. In development, it's going to run a bunch of times, but when our project's built, it's only going to be run once when the site is built for production. And this allows us to perform some action on the server. This function's only run on the server, and it allows us to pass props, allows us to pass data down to the client. You can see specifically when you should use getStaticProps. You want to do it generally when the data doesn't change a great deal. Otherwise, you would need to rebuild the site or use something like incremental static regeneration or get server-side props if it needs to be fully dynamic. There's a bunch of different approaches that you can take with Next.js, but for right now, we're just going to copy this and use it when we need to fetch data on the server. For right now, before we do that, before we use that, we're going to go to the Supabase folder and go to index.js, and we're going to create a client. We already have the Supabase package installed, Supabase.js. That's where we'll import create client. And after that, we can call create client. And first we want to pass in, then we can call create client, and then we can pass in our Supabase URL from process.env, because this is an environment variable. It needs to start with process.env dot, and if we head back, we can see it's the next public Supabase URL. And then after that, it will be the Supabase service role key. And we're going to get our returned client, so we'll put that in a variable, which we'll call Supabase, and export it. To be clear that we're just using this on the server, we could call this Supabase server if we liked. I'm going to leave it at Supabase. We're going to have a Supabase client with that exact name that we're going to be using only within our client-side code, not on the server. So we're going to head back to products, the products page, and we can go to the documentation if we like, the next documentation, and you can see here getStaticProps needs to be exported. It should be an async function, and this is because we're going to need to fetch some data from our database. So this will return a promise if we go to our Supabase documentation for our product table. You'll see here that we want to await. We take our Supabase client and we use from to select the particular table that we want to get data from. And we want to select the particular properties off of that we want to use. You can see here different properties are being selected. The ID column, the created at column name, slug description. If we want to read all of the rows that we have, or select all of the columns, we can use the asterisk here. So let's copy this. We'll head back to get static props, paste that in. We're getting not just product, but products. This will return an array. We first need to make sure that we are importing Supabase. So this is going to return an array of products, and we can just pass that as a property on the props object here. And we now can receive it within our products page as a prop of the same name, products. And we can log that just to see that we're fetching everything properly. So if we refresh, you can see that we're getting all 3 products that we added here, which allows us to, within our product card grid, if we remove that log, we can map over products with products.map, take each product, and there's a special component in our products folder called card. So we'll import card. We'll import it as product card, and we want to give it a key. As you saw, it includes an ID, so we can use product.id here. And we want to add a prop to the product card called product. So then we can go into that, destructure the product data from props. And here we'll return an article with the class product card. We'll expand that, and first we'll have a next link, and its href is going to be /products/product.slug. So this is going to link to the individual products page, and within it is going to be just a plain image, not a next image, and that's going to be set to /assets/product.slug.png. So all the images for our individual products are listed in the assets folder as well, according to their slug name, and we'll give it some alt text of product.name. Underneath that link, we'll have a header element, which will have a paragraph within it, which will contain the product's name. And then after the header, we'll have a footer, which will also contain a link to the exact same path, the dynamic path to our products page. This will have the class name more with the text see more. And then also within the footer, we'll have another div, and that'll contain a span element with the class pill. And this will contain the product category. So let's save the card, and we'll save the products page. Now we have cards for each of our products displaying their name, image, category, and they each direct us to their own specific product page where we want to display all the product's information in more detail. We're fetching product data from Supabase, we're linking to individual product pages, and now we want to build out the product page for the user who has not subscribed to our app, the user who is not paying. We'll focus on the premium content, the paid content, in a later step. Right now, we're just going to take a look at displaying each of these products in more detail for potential customers. So far, we've already used and displayed the name, the slug, the category. Now we want to display the description in a more expanded view of the product. To do this is a little bit trickier. Not only do we need to, in our individual product pages, need to use getStaticProps, we need to use it in combination with another server-side function called getStaticPaths. This is specifically if a page has dynamic routes, and we know that that's the case for our slug page here, our product page that has the parameter, the name parameter slug, I should say. In the next documentation, we can see a good example of getStaticPaths. For example, for a post, what we need to provide is within getStaticPaths some logic to get all of the paths, and in our case that involves communicating with our database, to say, okay, here are all the posts I have, here are all the products I have in our case. So in getStaticPaths, they are getting the ID for each of these posts. In our case, we need to specifically fetch all of the posts and just get the slug. We provide the paths as an array with this params property, and that gets passed to getStaticProps. So if we navigate to product/webdesign, getStaticProps is going to have on context, it's going to be provided as context, an object with a property params where the slug should be set to web design. And this allows us to use this slug, this value, to then perform a query to fetch all of the individual product data. It sounds complicated. It'll make a lot more sense when we write this out using code. So what's the first step? Well, we're going to add getStaticPaths and getStaticProps. As you can see, getStaticPaths requires using getStaticProps. So we can copy all of this. We'll head to our product page, paste that in, and we're going to start by getting all of the products, but just provide or get back the slug property. We don't need all of the properties. So we want to bring in Supabase. We'll import that. We'll await Supabase from product, and we just want to select the slug column. We're going to get back an object. As you might have seen in the last example, we get back an object, and on it's going to be a data property. We can use the colon to rename it or alias it to products. And then using this, we want to transform this array to an array that has a params object. So first we'll take products.map, map over each product, and we will return using a set of parentheses. We could also use an explicit return. Return an object that has, for each element, a params property, and it has to have a slug. This has to match this, whatever we specified here as the dynamic value for our route. And that's going to come from product.slug. And now we have our paths. We'll put that in a paths variable and then provide that here. Let's just put some dummy div here so we can see what this returns. And we can see for a fact that this getStaticPaths is called on the server if we just console log paths. So let's open up our terminal, and we can see here all of this is in the terminal and not in the console on the client. If we refresh our product page, this is what's being logged from getStaticPaths. So now getStaticProps on context is going to be an object, and it's going to have a params property, and on that params object there's going to be a property called slug, because that's what we specified here in paths for each of the paths. So now we have a slug within getStaticProps, which we can use to fetch an individual product to display in our page. So if we go to Supabase again and we want to take a look at filtering, we can use the EQ method to filter a given column, such as slug, and as the second argument we can provide what it should be equal to. So we can just copy that and say we have a product here, we want to select all fields, all columns, and we want the specific product where the slug column is equal to this dynamic slug value. And additionally, we want to chain on single, which is a method to return our data as a single object instead of an array. Then once again, we'll return our props object, and we're just going to call this, we can call the property on it whatever we want. We're going to call this product. So now we can remove the console log, add product, the product prop to product page, log product here. We can see for our web design product, we just get the web design data. If we go back to explore products and we go to Blender Basics, we just get that data. Now that we're fetching product data for the appropriate page, we can design the page content using the data that we're fetching. Before we do that, however, you probably saw this error, image is missing required alt property. This is a value that I forgot to provide on the home page. I'm just going to go back quickly and add that to pages. Image, just like a normal image, it needs some alt text, so we're just going to give it the text hero. It doesn't really have any meaning other than that. So we're going to go back to our individual product page. We're going to take this data and display it. So we'll head to products.slug.js, and we'll start by returning a section element with the class product section. Within it will be an article with the class product. Within that will be a div with the class product wrap. So we'll expand all that first. We're going to bring in the image component. We could also just use the plain image if we wanted, but since we have a big image here, we might want to use the next image package in order to hopefully load this a little bit more performantly. So with this image, we're going to need to provide a static width, which we'll set to 1000, and height. Because we're not importing it, we'll set the height to 300, and we're going to set the source to /assets/ and then insert the product slug.png and make sure, of course, to give it a name. Well, not a name, but set to the alt attribute from product.name. And then if we go outside this div called product wrap, but still within our article, we're going to add a section for all the content below the image. First, let's just check out our image right now. You can see it's filling up the full page at this width. On a larger breakpoint, it covers just a big segment of it. So within this new section, we're going to add a header element, which will contain an h3. This will be where we display the product name. And underneath header, we're going to have a section, which will contain a div, and that div will contain a paragraph with the text product.description. That's where we'll display our description. And then finally, still within this article, we'll add one more section. And this, for now, is going to be for a special component called promo card. We'll take a look at the appearance so far. And the promo card is what's going to be right here. Right now, we just have the image, name, description. And for the promo card area, we want this to be displayed. We want to have a call to action here for any user that's not logged in and therefore isn't a paying customer. We want to prompt them to subscribe, and this will take them to the pricing page. So that's what we're going to add to the promo card component. You want to import this from the products folder. Again, all of the pages, such as products here, we're in the products page. All of the related components are going to be in the corresponding folder. So any components for the products pages will be in the products folder, still within source, and promo card is going to be within components. So make sure to import that into the product page. We can remove the console log now. And for promo card, we're going to return a section which will have a div within it, and then another div. That will contain an h4 with the static text get instant access. Underneath, or as a sibling of that h4, we're going to have a paragraph. And I'm going to set just some inline styles because the font size, we want to make this paragraph a little bit smaller than the general font size of most paragraphs. So we want to set that to 1 rem, and we'll add some text to entice our user to subscribe. We'll say something like, access this product plus dozens of others when you subscribe. And then underneath these two divs, we're going to add a link to take users to our pricing page. So that'll be to /pricing. It'll have the classes primary and button with the text purchase. So again, in a later step, we're going to see how to actually access the course for any paying users. Right now, they're just going to see a preview image. What's important to us now is now handling on our pricing page how the user is going to pay for access to all of our products here, since we're including it in one bulk subscription. What do we do to collect payments? How do we manage their subscription? Well, that's all going to start with the pricing page. So we'll first design the user interface of that, and then we'll see how to make it functional. Now, before we even go through the steps of designing our pricing page, we have to answer that fundamental question: how do we get paid? How do we get money? Well, there's few options in this day and age that are better than Stripe to choose for your SaaS application, or any application for that matter, wherever you want to accept money, with the exception of some countries. that Stripe hasn't expanded into yet. Stripe is probably the best choice for you to accept payments, to serve as your payment processor. I've used it in production. I've used them for many, many years. You don't have to go off of my personal experience. There are plenty of companies making hundreds of millions of dollars, billions of dollars that use Stripe as the core part of their payment infrastructure. And it's incredibly easy to set up, as we'll see, using Stripe Checkout. So the first step that we're going to take is we're going to create an account with Stripe if you don't have one with them already. Fortunately, anybody can create an account. The only caveat to be aware of once you have created an account is that you're going to need to provide some business information. So for right now, we're just going to be testing it. We can fortunately use it as developers, but when you want to ship your product, you're going to need to provide some business information and go through the steps of activating your payments. We'll skip that for now. And what we first want to grab is our publishable key and our secret key. The publishable key, very similar to Supabase, can be displayed on the client. And be aware that this is just a test key. You'll get new keys if you go live with Stripe, if you want to accept real money. And your secret key should only be used on the server. So right now we want to copy our publishable key, and we'll go once again to our env file, and we'll add that to next public Stripe publishable key, and it should start with PK. Your publishable key should, and your secret key should start with SK for Stripe secret key, or server-side key. Next, we'll head over to the Products tab. We want to add a product, and this is going to be our premium plan. This is going to be our subscription. We could call it something like the Pro plan. We just want to have one of them, one particular plan. However, we're going to have a different price based off of the billing period, the interval. So we can give our product a name. We can give it an image and description if we like, but we don't need to. Standard pricing model. We can give it, for example, a monthly price to start off with, say $9.99 a month. We want it to be recurring. And for our first price, we're going to have it be monthly. Usage isn't metered. It's not based off of how much a customer uses it. We are going to provide all access. This is going to be an all access plan. And we can also add another price at the same time. Same thing, standard pricing. We might give a little bit of a price break due to it being a longer billing period. So for a yearly, let's say we have a yearly billing period, we might give them a price break have it be a couple of months off, so $100. We have the option to set a default price, and there are some additional options which don't really apply. We could provide a free trial if you like. This is a legacy option, and we can also add some more currencies. I'm going to be using US dollars by default. Feel free to use whatever currency here is supported, whichever you prefer and what your users accept. And then we want to save this. So what that did is it created one product, and we have a specific product ID that it's associated with, but two prices. These have their own distinct IDs, price IDs here. This is going to matter because we want to display both prices in our UI. And something else that matters is we can edit the price, and what matters is that here, let me choose this option, we can upsell to a certain amount. This is helpful because this upsell amount, if you choose, in this case this is the default, the upsell here will have a longer period of time recommended if we select upsells to and then select our yearly plan. We'll see just how that works when we get to the actual checkout step. Right now we want to take care of how do we actually display the information that we created here within our pricing page. Now that we have our created product and our two prices, our two tiers here, if we take a look at our README, we can see that there are a bunch of links to show you how to interact specifically with the Stripe API. And what we want to do is we want to list all of the prices. So we have a couple of created prices here. And just like how Supabase has an API for us, Stripe gives us an API. and we want to select the specific library that we're using. We're going to be using the Node.js library. So we're going to be writing some server-side JavaScript once again, and we're going to use the Stripe package with the secret key, again, on our server. We're going to be using Stripe. We're going to be using stripe.prices, and we want to list all of the prices that we have. And we're going to get that back. And what's great about Stripe and its excellent documentation is it shows you exactly what's going to be returned. So for us, what matters is it's good to have the ID. We also want the interval, we want the amount, and in what currency. So we have the unit amount, we have the currency. The only thing that we don't have is the name, but we'll see how to get that in just a second. So once again, we're going to use, if we head to, in this case, our pricing page. If we go to pages, pricing.js, we're not going to touch our component yet. We're once again going to be using getStaticProps. So we want to export async function getStaticProps. We only have one page, so we don't need getStaticPaths. We just want to list the prices. But before we can do that, we need to set up our Stripe integration. Instead of a separate folder here, we could put Stripe in a separate folder. We have within pricing, we have in the utils folder, the stripe.js file. And this is where we're going to be using the server-side Stripe library. It's just called Stripe. We want to import capital Stripe from Stripe, and then we want to say new Stripe and pass in our supplied Stripe secret key environment variable. And most people would just export, a new variable, give it the name lowercase s Stripe. One step that you should take is adding a second argument here, which is an object. And I'd highly recommend adding an API version. And the current version, which we'll be using, is the 2022 November 15th version. It's something to be aware of that Stripe periodically changes their API. We know about API versioning. If you go to their documentation, you can see all of the different changes in their APIs, and they do change them regularly. You can see sometimes that, they're just a quarter apart. This matters because you don't want to be burned by the API and any changes if you don't have, a fixed API version listed here. If the version's different, then you might not get the response that you expected. So we definitely want to lock that down to make sure our payment processing is reliable. And now going back to the pricing page, we can import Stripe and getStaticProps. And as we saw in the API documentation, we can just say await Stripe prices list. And once again, we're going to get back an object where we're going to have a data property. We'll rename that value to prices. Now, within prices, as you saw, it did not include, if we look at the API reference, we didn't get back in the response the name. We do want to display that on the page. We could hard code it, but it's just much better to get that dynamically from Stripe. In order to get that, we can use the retrieve product method. So Stripe products retrieve, and we just need to use the ID of the product itself to get, in our case, the product name. And what's really cool about the Stripe documentation is that it gives you realistic responses here. So you can see in my case, we want the name property, and it shows the property that I supplied to my one plan. So that's pretty neat. We can copy this. We're not going to have a hard-coded product ID value. And what's important about this is the fact that this is an array. So we can see we get back an array of prices as you would expect. So we want to iterate over it by saying for const price of prices. The reason why we want to use a for of loop is because this returns a promise. It's much easier to resolve a promise within a for of loop as compared to doing so with using the map function, for example. So here we can await stripe.products.retrieve, and we want to pass it the product ID from price.product, and we're going to get back the retrieved product, and instead of returning prices, we want to create an array called plans, which will pass to our pricing page. And we can say plans dot push. Want to push onto this array, and first we want to add the name property from product.name, and the rest of the properties are going to be from the price. We just want the ID, the price ID from price.id, the price, the monetary value itself from price.unit amount, and we can divide this by 100. The interval will be whether it's monthly or yearly, and that's going to come from price.recurring.interval. And then finally, after the for of loop, we can return, once again, a props object, and we can just put the plans array on that. Destructure plans from props in pricing page, we can log that, and we can return just a div, a dummy div. And if we take a look at the result, we can see, in my case, I have some test plans, but you should just see 2 array elements representing each price for our one pro plan. We're now fetching our prices for our one plan from Stripe. We want to display those in our pricing page. So on the left-hand side, we're going to provide an option for users to toggle between a monthly or a yearly plan and then check out. And then on the right-hand side, we're going to display some of the benefits of why you would want to subscribe, which is very important. We're going to begin by removing our console log, and we're going to start with a div which will have the classes grid halves once again, and the class hScreen navbar. It's just a little bit less than the full height of the screen just to accommodate the nav bar. And then we're going to have a plans component which comes from the pricing folder, pricing/components. We want to pass plans down to that as a prop. We're going to start with benefits, however. We want to list those out, and we'll make sure to import that from our components folder as well. This is just going to be all static text. You could definitely just display all these itemized benefits using an array, an array of objects. I think that's what I'll do actually. I'm going to return a div with the class bgblack that'll have within it a div, the class column padding. There's going to be a lot of divs. A div with the class content grid and the class XL. Within that, a div with the class spacing base. Within that, we're going to have an H3. It won't have any class. We're just going to have some text. And then after that will be a line break. And below this, the line break should be within the H3 here. Just for one of the items, I'm going to include the text one low price. That'll be the title. And then under the H3, we're going to have a div. And I'm just going to add some, you can include whatever text that you like here. For example, one low price, save big, get everything with a super low monthly subscription. We want to give them a reason for why they would want to subscribe. What's the benefits of doing so? So you can think about that for your particular product. And we can just include benefits as an array, and we'll include a title, and that will be in this case one low price, and then the subtitle save big. So we can take spacing base and make that our benefit. We could turn this into a separate benefit component, but there's not much JSX here, so we can just say benefits.map, take each benefit and paste in the div here. We'll set the key to benefit.title since they'll all be different. We'll display the title within the H3 and the subtitle within the div. And we just now need to add a few more bits of text. So I'll add another one, no limits. We'll say get complete access to everything on the site, and then cancel anytime. And we'll make it possible for users to cancel whenever they like, and we'll tell them pause or stop your subscription whenever you like. So let's save that and we'll take a look. So far it's on the left hand side. It's because we don't have anything within plans. This should in fact be on the right hand side. So to fix that, let's return within plans a div with the classes bgsalmon salmon as in pink, and then the class border right within it will be a div with the classes column, padding, and centered. Within that, a div with class callout wrap. Within that, a div with class plan. That will contain one called a div with the class plan wrap. That will contain one with the class plan switch. Up at the top in this switch area, we're going to have a little toggle and allow users to toggle between monthly and annually or yearly. So we're going to have the text monthly, and then we're going to include a label with the class switch. That will contain an input of type checkbox. And so this checkbox is going to be styled like a toggle component. And underneath that will be a span with the class name slider. So you can see what it looks like here. We can toggle between monthly, and on the other side, we'll just have yearly. Underneath that, we'll have the title. Obviously, we want the title of our plan, the name of our plan to be more precise. We'll display underneath that the price and the interval, and then we'll have a big button to check out. So after this div, after the plan switch div, we're going to have an h2 with the class plan-name and the contents plan.name. Now, we need to get just one of the plans from props. So what we can do is we can access the plans array. We're not going to see how to toggle between them yet. We will in just a bit. Right now we're just going to have a variable plan set to plans and just get the first or second plan in that array. Then underneath the plan name, we're going to have a div and say just plan price, and then a / plan.interval. And I'll add a $sign since mine's in USD. So we have our name, our amount, and interval. And then finally, we're going to have our big button at the bottom. So right after, as a sibling to this last div that we created, we're going to have another div that's going to contain a button with the class large button. That will contain a div as a child with the class large button text. And we're going to say within it, buy now. Now this doesn't look quite right, and this is because I forgot to add a div within plan wrap that will space out all of these elements a little bit more and add padding to our plan. We're going to have a div with the class plan content. We can paste in once again plan switch and all its siblings, and now we have a much better formatted plan. We can toggle between monthly and yearly. It doesn't display a different price. That's what we're going to get to in the next lesson. Before I move on to making our pricing page functional so that our buy now button works, let's make it so when we toggle from monthly to yearly and back that the price displayed within the card here changes accordingly. Right now, if we head to our plans page, we'll see that we've hard-coded our plan value just as the first element, whatever it is. The better way to go about displaying our plans, since we're only going to see one plan at a time, is to use some state. So we'll bring in use state from React, and we're going to give this new state variable the default value of month. This is going to be the interval, and we're going to call it the selected interval, or we're just going to call it selected. So we'll make a state variable with the name selected, and the setter will be set selected. And instead of just grabbing the first element, we want to take the plans array and we want to find the plan that has the interval from plan.interval equal to the selected value. So if we take that return value from find, and it's just going to return, find just returns one element based off of this condition, we can see we're now displaying the monthly plan because that's the value of selected, and if we were to change that to year, it changes accordingly. So now we just need to make our input here, our toggle here, change the selected value. We can do that by adding an onChange to our input. It's true that we don't have this within a form, but if we're using an input, we need to use an onChange as compared to an onClick. And we want to set this equal to a new function that we haven't created called toggle plan. And we'll make that above our return. And this is going to be a very simple function. It's just going to check the current value of selected. If it's equal to month, then it will change it to year. If not, if it's equal to year, then it'll change it back to month. So in short, it'll toggle the interval. We're going to put it in an interval variable, and we're going to pass that value to set selected and save. So hopefully now, when we click our toggle, we see the price changes accordingly. And personally, I'm going to change this to month by default. Feel free to use whichever interval you'd like to show users first. One of the greatest benefits of using Stripe, on top of the fact that it has a great API and gives us a really convenient dashboard to manage everything that we need, from customers to products, payments, billing, etc. It also gives us some really convenient low-code tools that will allow us to create a checkout page without having to design the UI, have it work across all different devices, include all the validation that we need. Normally something like this would be an immense undertaking to build a complex checkout that was also at the same time secure. Fortunately, Stripe gives that to us for free, and this is all provided through what's called Stripe Checkout. I've included within the README a link to Stripe Checkout. It gives a pretty high-level overview. Well, it's pretty in-depth and high level at the same time of everything that needs to be done. Includes a lot of code, includes a lot of links that goes through what you need to do in order to set up Stripe Checkout and to build a subscriptions integration. The way we're going to integrate Stripe Checkout with Next.js is through something called API routes. So we took a look at getStaticProps and getStaticPaths. The benefit of an API route using Next.js is all we have to do is drop in a folder called API and create a special type of page, which is really more like a function. You can see this function here. It's very similar if you're familiar with the Express framework, the Express Node.js framework, to just functions that take a request and return a response. So it allows us to do stuff on the server. We can send requests to our API routes, which are ultimately just API endpoints, and to perform some server-side logic. That's exactly what we're going to be doing in making Stripe Checkout work to create a checkout session. So we're going to begin by heading back to our pricing page, and specifically we're going to be going into our plans component. We're going to make a new function. This time it'll be an async function called onCheckout. This is going to be called whenever a user clicks on the Buy Now button. So we'll add an onClick and set that equal to a reference, the reference to this onCheckout function. And here is where we want to make a request to an endpoint. Again, all API routes are included in this API folder and pages. I've already taken the liberty of making it for you, as well as all the API routes, all the endpoints that we'll have. As you can imagine, the request that we're going to be making is to the checkout endpoint, and API routes can also have dynamic endpoints as well. So we're going to pass along with the request the specific price ID from our plan. Now, since we're working in our front end, we're going to need to make a network request to our back end. There's no special syntax. It's just the same as if we were to call an API endpoint, any API endpoint, if it was external to our app or not. Here we can await fetch. We can use the fetch API to make this request, and we want to, before we include the path, we want to include the site URL. And in development, that's going to be localhost 3000. In production, that's going to be our deployed website URL. And since this value is going to change depending on what environment we're in, and we need to reuse this site URL across our website, across our project, I should say, we can include it in source core utils in this common utils folder. And we want to create an uppercase variable site URL where if we're in production, and we can determine that by comparing process.env.node.env, which gives us the environment that we're in, whether it's production or development or test. We can compare that with production, and if we're in a production environment, we want this to be our production URL, which we don't know just yet. Otherwise, we want it to be localhost 3000. So make sure to export this site URL, and we can reuse it whenever we want to make a request to an API route. So include a template string here, pass in site URL / API / checkout, and then we need to include the price ID. And that's going to come from plan.id, and we're going to get back a response of some sort. We haven't created this function yet, but what we want to return is we want to return the session, the created session for our checkout. So that's what we're going to do in our checkout endpoint. If we go to that in the priceid.js file, we see we have a handler here, and this is where we're going to be creating a Stripe checkout session. As I mentioned, with a API route, we're going to receive a request, and that's going to include data from the request that we're making, and that includes stuff like the URL here. So we'll be able to grab the plan ID from that, and then we want to return with the created session on or using the response, what's on the response object. So first, we're going to need to take the request, and we can use the query property off of it to get the price ID. Again, matching our dynamic route, what we provided as the name here, and we can use this syntax, or we can destructure it into its own variable. So now that we have the price ID, what do we need to do? Well, once again, we want to bring in Stripe from our pricing utils folder, and we want to await Stripe checkout.sessions, and we want to create a new session. And there's some key information that we need to provide. First of all, we want to provide a mode, and we see some options here. We're going to choose subscription, so it's a subscription payment. Next, we want to select the payment method types, and this accepts an array. There's a bunch of different options here. I'm going to go with the simplest and most popular option, which is just card, although there's a bunch you can choose from. We need to include line items, and this is where we're going to pass in an array of objects. It's an array because you can have multiple items. You can include multiple things to check out at once, because Stripe Checkout works with one-off purchases. And within line items, we want to include a price property and set that equal to the price ID that we're getting from the request, and set its quantity to just 1 to create one subscription. And then finally, we want to add a success URL. Where should the user be taken if this whole process, if the checkout process was successful? So once again, we can reuse the site URL and just provide the path success after it. And for cancel URL, if a user cancels, we just want to send them back to pricing, if they were to cancel throughout the process of checking out. And then finally, this create method is going to return a checkout session, which we can then return. We can send it back to the client using res or response.send and pass in an object with an ID property set to session.id. We can save this, and what matters about this ID is that once we get back the data from response, and to do so we need to await response.json, we get back our data. We then need to do something new, which is load Stripe on the client, and we can do that with the Stripe.js library. So we can await load Stripe from that dependency, and we want to pass in the publishable key from process.env. We can copy the full value from next public Stripe publishable key. And once Stripe is loaded, then we can await Stripe.redirect to checkout. So redirect to checkout will use that ID value that we got from our created checkout session, pass it to this method, and then take us to our created checkout page made just for that customer. And we need to provide redirect to checkout an object where session ID will be set to data.id. So let's save all that and let's test this out. We'll select buy now, and I didn't import site URL. I'll fix that. Try that one more time. And now we're redirected to the Stripe website, to checkout.stripe.com, where we see we can subscribe to the Pro plan, $9.99 per month. And because we included the yearly plan as the upsell, we have this little option to also be able to choose that. And it immediately shows here the benefit of doing so. So this is a great feature about Stripe Checkout, is that it includes so much neat stuff right out of the box. It includes all the information that the customer needs, their subtotal, total due today, and all they need to do to pay with card is to provide their email, card information, name, zip, and then hit subscribe. So let's do that. Provide our email. We can include, since we're testing this, we can include a fake card and CVC. We'll include some name, a zip, and then hit subscribe. And it looks like it was successful, so then we're taken to our unstyled success page. And if we go to customers in Stripe, we have our new created customer here. Now we have the ability for customers. Now that we've added the ability for customers to check out, let's improve what they see when they actually do so successfully. Before we do that, however, let's navigate back to our pricing page. One little improvement that we can make is that when a user clicks buy now, you could see that there was a little bit of a delay before they were actually taken to Stripe checkout. To improve that, we can change the text here from, say, buy now to something a little bit more descriptive by adding another state variable, which by default will be false. And we're going to call this is redirecting, and the setter will be set redirecting. So when we start this process of checking out, we set redirecting to true, and then after we've redirected, set that to false. The benefit here as well, in addition to being able to change the text, is we can disable the button. So we can set the button's disabled attribute to true when we're redirecting, when we're in the process of checking out, just so that they don't click on it twice to make a duplicate request. And we can also change the text here and say, if is redirecting is true, we can say loading, otherwise buy now. And now to improve the appearance of our success page and show our user a little bit of fanfare, to congratulate them a little bit when they finish the process and tell them what the next step should be, we want to return, if we go to the success page, we can return a div with the classes section, BG pink, and height screen. The first step to this is we want to remove the nav bar here. We can include it, but we don't have to, specifically because on the success page we're going to tell them how to log in, and we really only want them to perform one action. They're also not going to be logged in here. We're going to give them instructions on how to log in. We'll touch on that in a bit, but they don't need these confusing buttons at the top, login, pricing, right after they've checked out. So we can head back to navbar, or rather our layouts folder, and go to our app layout, although this could work in navbar as well. We want to hide the navbar on certain routes, and to do so we can bring in router information that tells us what page we're on using the use router hook. We can store that in this router variable, and we can say for some pages within an array, and this set of pages we'll call the hide navbar pages, we can provide an array, and this will be a number of different paths that we want navbar to be hidden on. So one of them is the success page. So we can say hide navbar pages. If that includes the current route that we're on, and we can get that from router.asPath, we want hide navbar to be true. And that allows us to write a conditional where we say, if hide navbar is true, we want to return null and not show the navbar, otherwise show it. So now we just have this big pink background. And first of all, we want to show something fun. So we'll add a div with the class container. Within that will be a div with the classes section, intro, and the class welcome. The first thing that we'll show them will be an image. So we'll bring in next image. And there's a special confetti image from assets. So we'll import that. Import confetti from 2 levels up, public assets confetti.png, and we'll set source to that. We can still set the height and width if we want. So we can set the height to 200, the width to 200, the alt text to confetti, and the class name to confetti. And underneath the image, we'll include the text, you're in, and after that will be a paragraph saying, you can now access everything on this site. We'll have a line break and ask them ready to get started. And what's going to follow that is going to be a link to login. So we'll include a link with an href set to /login, where the class name will be set to large button, and a child div with the class name large button text with the text get started. So we're going to direct them to the login page, not to get ahead of ourselves, but we're going to direct them to the login page. You can see what we have so far. Looks pretty nice. We want them to get started, and we could also say, go to login. What we're going to do, and it's going to make this process a lot easier for our users, we want our users to access our product as quickly as possible. We don't want them to jump through hoops in order to create an account and then pay. So through the checkout process, if it's successful, what we'll do is we'll create an account for them, and that'll be based off of the information that they provided, so that when they're successfully checked out, we can check out one more time, what they'll be able to do is once they're all done and they're redirected to the success page, an account will be created for them on the back end, and they can then go to the login page and just provide their login email. They won't even need a password in order to start accessing their content. So that whole process of automatically creating an account for our user on the back end for them to log into is what we're going to work on in the next step. After checking out a couple of times, we have 2 new customers in Stripe, but we don't have anything in our database. We have some products, but we also want to hold on to the user information in its own table. What we need to get is we need a callback, a way to get data from Stripe that our purchase was successful or not successful, and then sync the data from Stripe that was received in that successful payment and use that to then sync the data, the user's name, email, subscription details with our Postgres database. The ability to get that information is going to come in the form of a webhook, and this is something that's provided by Stripe. We're going to be able to provide an endpoint that is a server endpoint, an API route from our own application that Stripe is then going to send all of the event data from that subscription event over to, and within that API route, we're going to add all the data that we need to our database. Since we're running our project just on localhost on our computer, we're going to need a way to, without deploying our project, pass a legitimate endpoint to Stripe. And the way that we can do that is in the form of a tool called ngrok. We can use npx to use ngrok and its HTTP command to tunnel the server that's running on localhost 3000 to something that can actually be given to Stripe in the form of a legitimate secure URL. So when we run this command npx ngrok http 3000, we want to say yes to install the ngrok package, and we're going to be given this URL that takes care of the forwarding for us. So we can test this out in development and write code, but we still have something that satisfies Stripe, that Stripe can actually work with, which, it can't work with just localhost 3000. We want to add an endpoint here. We want to make sure that we grab the secure, the HTTPS URL here, and I've already created the endpoint that's going to take care of receiving Stripe events at /API/webhooks. So make sure to add that at the end of your copied URL. We want to listen to events on our account, and we want to select a couple of events, and these are in customer, and we specifically want customer subscription deleted and customer subscription updated. And we can select add events and then add endpoint. Here we're going to be given the signing secret. We need this to be able to successfully receive these webhooks. So we're going to go to .env.local and provide that to the Stripe signing secret environment variable. And we'll head to the webhooks endpoint, and we're going to begin just by receiving an event. We're going to see how to receive an event from Stripe and just log it before we do anything with it. The first thing that we'll need to do is we want to take the request and we want to grab the request headers. We're going to need the Stripe signature header. We're going to store that in a variable called signature. We need to verify that this comes from Stripe, so this is why we need this value. We're also going to need our signing secret, and that comes from process.env.stripe signing secret, just like this. And we also are going to need to take the request and turn it into a buffer, something called a buffer. And this is for Stripe to construct a webhooks event for us. So to do that, we need to import a package that we have installed called rawbody, and that's going to take our request and turn it into a buffer. And we're going to import specifically a function called getRawBody, and this returns a promise. So we'll await getRawBody, pass in the request, and we're going to get back a buffer, which we can name as rawbody or buffer. It doesn't matter. And we want to set up a try catch because this operation can fail, and we want to catch any errors and log them. We're going to log something like webhook signature verification failed if this happened. And we're going to try to construct an event. And we'll make sure to import Stripe. And we're going to be using webhooks. And we're going to use the construct event method. Again, this is all Stripe specific stuff. You can see this in the documentation. We'll need to pass in the rawbody first, then the signature, then the signing secret. And if Stripe was able to construct an event successfully, we'll be able to store it in a variable called event. We want to place it outside the try catch. And if it was constructed successfully, we should be able to log it. So at the end here, we can log event. We can see all the data that we get. And if we get something sent back to us successfully, we'll just say res.send an object where success is set to true. But if it fails in the catch, we can just return, we want to return early and say res status and set the status code to 400, indicating that this was a failed request, dot end. So we don't need to pass any payload or extra information. And now that we have all this and we are listening for events, we're going to head back to pricing. We'll go through the checkout process and pay for our plan, and make sure to not click Save My Info and then hit subscribe. And if we wait a second and then check our logs here, make sure that, by the way, you must make sure that you have your app running on localhost 3000 as well as ngrok running at the same time. You might get an error saying internal server error, stream is not readable. And the reason for that is we need to add one extra bit of configuration. We need to export a config, which is equal to an object, and that should have an API property, which should have its own property body parser set to false. If we don't include this, we're not going to be able to get the buffer correctly, and Stripe won't be able to construct the event. If we want to catch that error, we can move this into the try catch. We can also set a limit for get raw body, say to a value like 2 megabytes. This is also helpful to have. And now let's try one more time. We'll go back to pricing, go through the checkout process. We see we have a log for the event customer subscription updated, which is what we're listening for, with all the data that we need, which we'll be using in order to create or update a user's profile. Now that we're getting this data from Stripe about a successfully created subscription, we can go ahead and create the profile table in Supabase. What's important to keep in mind is we don't want to include any hard-coded values from the subscription that's been created. What I mean by that is it's best to include references. For example, a reference to the subscription ID. This means that even if other data is to change, as long as we have that reference, we can still retrieve that data, up-to-date data from Stripe. We don't want to include hard-coded values like the price number, the amount of the subscription. These are all values that can be had from Stripe. We just want to know whether the subscription's active, because it's going to matter for us what we display to our user. So with that in mind, we can go ahead and head to Supabase and create a new table in our table editor. We'll select new table, and once again you can reference the tables.txt file. We want to include the user's name, email, which fortunately they include when they use Stripe Checkout. We want to grab the customer ID, the subscription status, which will be something like active or canceled, the price, which is actually the price ID, and we'll touch on the user ID in just a bit. Right now we're going to go ahead and create our table with the name profile. We'll disable row level security for now. We'll add our name column, which will be of type text. We do want to make these nullable just in case. This is because getting that data is dependent on Stripe's API. We don't want to reject or not create a profile just because maybe one field isn't provided by Stripe, even though that'll likely never happen. We're going to add the email column, which will also be of type text, the Stripe customer ID of type text, subscription status, type text, price. You can call this price or price ID and set this to type text, and we'll hit save. So now that we have our created profile table, we can now take care of updating a subscription as well as deleting a subscription for the appropriate event. So remember from event, and once again, we can head to Stripe's documentation. If we go to the link event object for webhooks, we can take a look at what's going to be returned. It gives us at the end the type of event. In our case, it's customer subscription updated. So we can include a conditional, and this can be added after the first try catch. We can add another try catch. We'll wrap it around all of this. And at the very end, if there's an error, we can console log the error from error.message and just send back success false. But within the try, we're going to include a switch statement. We're going to switch based off of the event type value. And for the first case, if that matches customer subscription updated, we want to run a function called update subscription. We'll make this async because we'll interact with Supabase here. Async function update subscription, and it's going to receive the event object. So we'll pass event to it and await update subscription. We'll make sure to break if this case is met. We'll add another case for customer subscription deleted. And this is where we're going to call, instead of update subscription, we're going to call delete subscription. We'll pass in the same event, make sure we call the correct function, and in the next step we'll take care of actually completing this function whenever we have a new or updated subscription. Now we can move on to adding functionality to our update subscription function. So we're going to get an event from our Stripe webhook, We can see all the information here in the documentation. We can see the event object. We need to make sure that it's of the correct type. So this is the correct one, customer subscription updated. We're going to look at the events object from event.data.object. There are a few important values here. Again, most of them are going to be IDs that we can reference and then use to call Stripe's API later. So we're going to have a reference to the created customer. Stripe Checkout is automatically going to create a customer for us. That's what we saw in the Customers tab. So that has its own ID. We're going to need the customer field. That's what we want to store on our profile. We want to store the status. If we scroll down, we're going to get status set to active. That refers to our subscription. And we're also going to get from the object this items property, which will include its own data property, which is an object. And from that, we just want a reference to the price ID. What was the price that they chose? So again, if we change the values, we still have a reference to the ID so that we can query for it later if we needed it. So let's begin by grabbing all these values. We're going to get the event. From event, we're going to get data.object, and this is what we're going to call our subscription. So we can more easily reference this. The Stripe customer ID, which is one of the columns that we created, we'll put a value in a variable, and that will be set to subscription.customer. We'll get the subscription status, that active value, and we'll put it in subscription status. Then we're going to have our price ID set to the price variable from subscription items data, and get the first element in that array dot price dot ID. And this is where we want to check if we have an existing profile. If we have an existing profile, we'll use await Supabase from profile. We can select anything. I'll just select all columns. It doesn't really matter. We're just checking for the existence of the profile. We want to see if it's equal to, if the Stripe customer ID column is equal to the value that we're getting. Meaning if we have an existing customer, we want to check for them, and we just want to get a single value back, a single record back. So we'll get back data and set that to profile. If we have an existing profile, we just want to update their subscription. So we'll make an object called updated subscription, and we'll include the subscription status and the price ID. And if we take a look at the documentation for Supabase, we haven't covered updating or creating records yet. If we go to profile and we scroll down and we look at update, we can use the update method, and we can just pass in whatever new values we want merged with the existing values. So we can simply say await Supabase from profile update and pass in our updated, make sure it's past tense, subscription object. And finally, we do need to make sure that it is equal to the right row. So we want to say equal, the Stripe customer ID is again equal to the Stripe customer ID that we received. Otherwise, else, if the profile doesn't exist, if Supabase can't find it, we want to create a new profile. But we're going to take a slightly different approach. We're going to collect all the data that we need, but one issue is that the event object from the subscription event doesn't include any information about the user's name that they provided or their email. But we do know that Stripe created a customer, and we know if we go to customers here, we have their name and email. So we just need to retrieve that customer using the retrieve method from customers. So we can copy this and we can say await stripe.customers.retrieve Stripe customer ID. We'll set that equal to customer. We'll get the name from customer.name the email from customer.email, and we're going to make a new profile object with all of the values that we need: name, email, Stripe customer ID, subscription status, and price. But instead of using insert, if we again look at Supabase documentation, we could use insert to insert a bunch of rows or one row. We're instead going to use a reference to supabase.auth.admin, and we want to create a user using the authentication API. So we'll see why in just a second. If we go to the API docs and we search for auth.admin, we're not going to see it here. We might need to go to API reference, and let me search for auth.admin. So if we scroll down, you'll see that to use supabase.auth.admin, we need to create a client like we did. It needs to have a URL and a service role key, not just an anon key. But this allows us to do special things on the server, make sure that this is only called on the server. In particular, we want to create a user, and we can pass in an email and any user metadata that we like. For us, we're going to pass in an email. We're going to confirm their email so that they don't have to. And we're going to set user metadata to this new profile object. So with all that done, let's go through the checkout process again, go back to pricing. We'll provide all of our info again. And if we check our terminal, we don't see any logs. And if we go to Supabase, we go to our table editor, we'll find that we don't have a profile created, but if we go to authentication, we do have a new user. So in the next step, we'll talk about what exactly this is, what happened, and what we can do next to create our profile. We haven't touched on authentication yet, but Supabase is there to take care of authenticating our users. We'll see how exactly in just a bit. But for right now, it might seem a bit confusing that we created a profile table and we also have this built-in. So this is built in to Supabase. If we go to the authentication tab, we can see that we have a user here. And this is displaying all users. So we created a user on a special table that Supabase internally uses to manage our users. And it includes with a bunch of its own related data. We didn't have to set up any of this. We can see this if we go to the SQL editor. We can make sure that we remove all this. And we can just say select all from auth.users. And if we run this, we see a bunch of information with a bunch of columns that may not mean anything to us. Some things are familiar, like the email, but there's things like invited at, confirmation token, etc. These are all internal to Supabase. But what's interesting here is that we have raw app metadata, and we have the raw user metadata as well. This is what we passed to the user metadata property. And this was all of the stuff that Stripe passed along in the webhook. So we have created a new user on the users table in Supabase. So we can actually log in a user with this email, with the email that we provided. And we can use all this user metadata to create a profile that includes all the correct columns. But the question is, how do we use that user metadata to create a new profile? We can do that with the help of a database feature called a function. Functions allow us to run SQL to perform a given operation on our database, and these functions are triggered with the help of a database trigger. If we navigate to our project and we take a look at the create profile.sql file and all the code that we have in it, this is the SQL that we're going to execute to take all of the raw user metadata and insert that into a new profile row. So if we're on the database functions page, we want to create a new function, and we want to give it the appropriate name for the operation we're performing, and that is create profile. The schema is going to be public. That's where we can create new tables, and it's not internal to Supabase, unlike all the rest of these tables that you see here. We want the return type to be void. We don't need any arguments, but the definition we're going to get from createProfile.sql, so just copy that. We're going to insert all this data, all these values into the profile as a new row, and we need to scroll down and show advanced settings and set the types of security to security definer. And if we attempt to make a new function that's returning void, we're going to get an error, so we want to set the return type to trigger. This is going to ensure that we have the created user from auth.users that we can reference on this new value. We can hit confirm, and then we want to create a trigger. We'll go to the triggers page, create a new trigger, and we're going to say on create user. We want to have the table be the users table. We're going to listen for the insert event. We're going to trigger this function on the insert event. When a new row is added, we want it to be fired after the event. We want it to be fired for each row, and we want the function createProfile to be triggered. So we'll hit confirm, and now we want to test and create a new user in auth.users and then see whether our function is going to create a new profile. For now, we're going to delete our user in authentication. We'll hit confirm. You'll see that in our tables and profile, we don't have anything. We want to go to customers. We can refresh, and we want to remove any customers that we have and wait just a little bit for those to be deleted. And when that's done, we're going to go back. We're going to go back to pricing, go through the checkout process again. And then when we head to Supabase, we'll see if we're on the profile table, we have a profile added. That's a good sign. If we go to authentication, we still have our user with the same email matching. And then if we check all of those individual columns, we can see that our new profile has everything: the name, email, Stripe customer ID, subscription status, price, and user ID, which is referencing the underlying auth.users record right here. As you can see, we're now successfully syncing the data coming in from our Stripe Webhook's API endpoint with our Supabase database. So if we get an event where the customer subscription is updated, we're either going to create or update their profile. But now we want to take care of, for our Stripe customers, whenever a subscription is canceled. So if we select a given user, if we select a customer, we can cancel their subscription by hitting this X. This is something that we want to allow our users to do when they manage their billing. We're going to see later how to do that, how users can do that on the front end when they're signed in using Stripe. But we also want to be able to take care of it on the back end to cancel a customer's subscription if we want. We need to have that event data synced with our user. So we need to finish our webhook, and we need to finish the delete subscription function. Just like update subscription, it's going to take an event, and we can just copy these first three variables in update subscription. We're going to get the subscription data, the customer ID, the status, and we're going to create an object called deleted subscription, where we'll perform a similar action as we had if we had an existing profile. We're going to first add the status and price, which will be set to null on this deleted subscription object. And we want to update, in this case, from profile, update our user, update our profile with this new data. In this case, the status will be set to canceled and the price will be null since they're not paying for anything anymore. And we want to do that only if our Stripe customer ID matches what we're getting from the event. So let's save that and make sure the forwarding from ngrok is still working. Keep in mind that it does expire after a certain period of time, so you might have to rerun that script. And if we cancel our subscription on the back end, we can choose when we want to do so. we'll do so immediately. When that happens, we can head back to our table editor and take a look at profile. And we should now see that our subscription status is canceled for our one user and price is set to null, which is exactly what we want. Now that we have a user, we have a created profile, we have a user in our auth table, we can go ahead and create the login page. Right now we have nothing. The first step to doing this is making it possible to access a user's session on the client. So we're going to be talking about session management here. This is how Supabase allows us to work with users that are logged in. We're going to see how to do so to work with sessions both on the client and the server. Now, on the login page, we're going to need to have a form for the user to log in. We've created an account for them automatically, and their account is going to be based off of their email. Now, fortunately, with Supabase, we have the ability to use magic link authentication. So we can send them an email, which we can customize here if we go to authentication and email templates, where a user just has to click a link to log in. So in order to create a login form, we just need to provide an email field and then submit the form. Now, we're going to need to call a special function from Supabase auth. We can go to authentication. If we look at user management, we're not going to be using sign up or login with password, sign in with password. We're going to be using the sign in with OTP or one-time password. And here we just need to provide the email. To get the user session after they log in, we're going to need to use some specific helpers that were made by Supabase that allow us to access the current user once the user is logged in. These are available in the auth helpers packages. We needed to install the auth helpers Next.js package and the auth helpers React package. And if we look at the Supabase documentation, you'll see that we need to provide a couple of environment variables in our .env.local file. We've already done that. And to start getting the session and managing the session on the client, we just need this session context provider. So we're going to copy these two lines here. We're going to bring in the session context provider from auth helpers React and the create browser Supabase client from Supabase auth helpers Next.js. And this is going to be provided in the app page up at the very top. So we'll bring both of those in. We want to grab session context provider, where it's being returned here. And we want to make sure our app layout is within the provider so that we can access the session, for example, within our navbar. And to get our Supabase client, we need to use state and create the Supabase client using the imported function. So we'll bring in this line and we'll make sure to import use state. And that's all we need to do. The benefit of this is that we can use some really convenient hooks throughout our application. We can access the user within our API routes on the server, and we can use some special hooks like use user and use session on the client to get the user or session data. For right now, we're going to move over to building out our login page. We're going to return a div with the classes grid halves and height screen. This will contain a div with the classes border right and BG off white. That will have a child div of class column padding, which will have a child with the class tablet centered. We can expand all that. You can see what it looks like currently. We want to remove the navigation here, so we'll go into the app layout and add the login path to our hide navbar pages array. So that's removed. We're going to add a link at the very top. This will take users back to the home page, and we're going to give it the class logo container. So we're going to include the logo. We'll import that from core components logo. And we're going to give this a slightly smaller width, so we'll set inline styles to make the width 150 pixels. And then underneath that, we're going to add the login form component. And then finally, after on the other side of the screen, on the right hand side, you can see we just have a logo on the left hand side, but on the right hand side, we just want to include an image like we have on the home page. So we'll add a div with the class BG navy and border right. And within it will be the image component from next image. And there's another special image from our assets folder. We'll call this login from 2 levels up, public/assets/login.png. And then we can set source to login. The alt text will be login, and the class, like on the home page, is callout image. So we have our image here. We just need to add our form. So we'll jump into the form component, the login form component, and this is going to consist of a form element. So we'll say form.content-grid and another class of home-hero. We don't need to provide an action. We'll include an h1 with the text welcome back. Then as a sibling, a div with the class email input. This will consist of a label and input as children. The HTML4 for the label will be email with the text label with the text email, and the input will have the ID email, type email, and name email. Then after the div, we're going to have a button of type submit with the class large button with a div inside that'll include the text. So we'll have the class large button text. And for now, we're just going to include the text login. So we have our completed form, and we can also add an autocomplete if we like, set to email. This will autocomplete the user's email to help them out when providing it. And what we want to do is very simple. We just want to collect, when the form's submitted, the value of the email input. We want to sign in our user with a one-time password to send them a magic link. And then we want to show an error if the operation was not successful. So all of this is pretty straightforward. We'll see how to do all that in the next step. Let's start by adding an onSubmit to our form within login form. We'll begin by making an async function that'll have the name onSubmit. We'll receive the event when the submit event is fired, when our form's submitted. And we want to call event.preventDefault to make sure our page isn't reloaded. And to get the value that's typed into the input, we can get it from event.target.elements. And since we've included an input with the ID of email, it'll have a property email, and we can get its value from the value property. And we can set that to a variable called email. This is where we can use the Supabase client to sign in our user with a one-time password. So the hook that we can use is use Supabase client. We can call that up at the top. We can access this throughout our entire app because we're now using the session context provider that's passing down this created browser Supabase client to the Supabase client prop. So now we can call that without any arguments and get our Supabase client, which enables us to await Supabase client.auth, sign in with OTP. We provide our email as the first property, and we can add some additional options which are important. On this options object, we want to set should create user to false. We want to make sure that this does not create a user. And additionally, we want to, because the user is signing in with magic link auth, we can specify where the email should redirect to. Now, in development, we want it to just redirect to localhost, and in production, we want it to actually redirect to the production website, whatever the URL is. So to get the appropriate value, we can just use window.location.origin, and that's really all that we need. What's important here is we just want to keep track of whether there's an error. So this will return to us an object where we don't need the data, but it's going to give us an auth error. For example, if we try to provide, for example, a email that doesn't exist in our database, it's not associated with a given user, we're going to get an error. And if we log our error message, we'll see that we got a 400 error with the text signups are not allowed for OTP. So we want this to be stored and displayed in our form. To do so, we can bring in use state, and we'll set one state variable to an empty string. This will be our error state, and the setter will be set error. So now, if we have an error, we can set error to error.message. We can also set a new setter for an uncreated state value that'll be responsible for loading. We'll set that to false, and we want a state variable called loading, and the setter will be set loading. If we have an error, we want to set loading to false, as compared to the beginning of the operation where if we're submitting this, we want to set it to true. Again, this flag, this value is really helpful for disabling our form. So we can disable our submit button if we're in the process of loading. And then additionally, we can console log the entire error. However, if we don't have an error, we can set the error to its initial value. We can reset that, set loading to false as well. And we also want to set the email and state. We'll get to that in a second, but first we want to display the error. And we can do that above the H1, and we can just add a conditional and say, if we have an error message in state, we can display it within a div with the class name danger and the role alert. So this is a little alert message that will display the error message that we've set in state. If an error occurred, we can interpolate it here. So now, if we provide an email that doesn't exist, hit enter, we see a nicely formatted error message, signups are not allowed for OTP. And then the last step is that if we actually provide a valid email, if we provide one that corresponds to an actual user in the auth.users table that matches their email, then we want to give them a little message saying, click the link in the email that was just sent to you to the email address that you provided. To do that, we're going to store this email in state, but we're going to lift the state up above the login form, and it's going to exist within the login page itself. So here is where we want to bring in use state, and once again we'll set that equal just to an empty string by default. And this value is what we're going to call submitted, and the setter set submitted. The setter is going to be passed down to login form, and if we go back into it, we want to destructure that as a prop, and in the else condition and on submit, we want to set submitted to the email. And if we have an actual value, if submitted is not just an empty string, we want to display a new component, login submitted. That's going to provide those instructions that we mentioned. So here around login form, we're going to provide a ternary. We're going to add some conditional JSX and say if submitted is truthy, then we want to display login submitted. So we'll import that. And we want to pass down the submitted email down to the login submitted component. From there we can destructure it. And here we're just going to return a very simple component. We're going to have a div with the class content grid and home hero. This will have an H1 with the text link sent, and then underneath that we'll have the text in a paragraph, a set of paragraph tags. Check your email, and then we'll display within a set of parentheses submitted, that's the email itself. Check your email to finish logging in. So we can save that, save our login page, and now provide a valid email for an existing user, hit login, and we see link sent. And one last step that we can take, I'll refresh this, is we can change, just like we had for the pricing page, if we head back to login form, we can use isLoading if it's true to change the button text. So if isLoading is true, we can say logging in ... instead of just login. And so we can see that something's actually happening behind the scenes. Be aware that you can only have your users request a one-time password every 60 seconds, so this is rate limited. This is something that can be configured. If you go to providers, you can customize a bunch of stuff here. If you go to authentication providers and auth providers, you can set how long it takes before an OTP link expires, and you can see all of the different auth providers that can be accepted as well on top of just email. So be aware of that. Supabase makes it incredibly easy to add tons of different authentication strategies besides just magic link auth. And if we try this once again, if we log in, we see the login text and another login link was sent. Right now I have my email open and you can see the magic link was sent to me a couple of times here. Make sure that you select the last link, the last email. It might be collapsed if you're using Gmail, so make sure you click on these three dots. And once you see the login link, you can just click on it, and we're going to be redirected back to localhost 3000. Something to be aware of is that you need to specify, if we go to URL configuration in the authentication page, that we have a designated site URL, and by default it's localhost 3000. We're going to need to change this when we deploy our project, and if a redirect URL is not working, it's likely because you haven't specified it here. So the redirect from our magic link back to our application is only going to work if the URL that our site is running on, or the port that our site is running on, is specified in this redirect URLs section. So just be aware of that. If we go back to our project and we open up the console and we go to the application tab, if we check on cookies, we can see that there's in fact a cookie added with the name Supabase auth token, and we can access its value. This is what Supabase internally accesses in order to give us our session, give us the current session. Now, we're not displaying that within our navbar, so this is where it's going to be effective to use the hooks that Supabase Auth Helpers React comes with. If we go to our navbar component, we can use a couple of hooks. Use user from Auth Helpers React and use session. And I'm going to log both of the values here. What's important to note about them is that they're both objects, and we'll get a better look at them if I just wrap them in an object. We can see the user here, and the user has exactly the same data as we saw in our authentication page. And if we go to users, it has the exact same data that we saw here when we took a look at the columns listed here, or we queried for all of our auth users using this SQL command. It consists of all the same stuff. The session, however, includes some additional information. It also includes a user property, but it includes specific information about the token that was put in our browser and is associated with our current session. This can also be accessed on the server. We'll take a look at that in a bit. But this probably includes a bunch of metadata that you don't need. However, if you just need to check that someone's logged in, you can use session for it. If you need specific data off of the user, and in our case, it's mainly going to be the ID, you can use user. We're going to use session here in order to display some different links up within our header, because even though we're logged in, our user doesn't know it. And keep in mind that, just one small thing to note, if we refresh the page and we attempt to log our session, it's going to be null by default, so just be aware of that. For our navbar, we want to display some additional links. We want to display a products link, a billing link, and a button to sign out. So first of all, we're going to create a conditional here. We could create a separate component, but it's a pretty small one, so we'll just write an inline conditional by checking to see if we have a session. If we don't, we'll leave the same nav menu, but if we do, we're going to have a new div with the same class, nav menu, and this is going to have a couple of links and a div that we'll click on to sign out. So this last div will have the classes nav link and black, and it's going to have a child div with the text sign out. These two links are going to be different. As I mentioned, the first one's going to be products with the text products, and the next link is not going to be a next link. It's just going to be a set of normal anchor tags. And the classes are going to be navlink, border left, white, with the text billing. And this is going to be possible. This is going to make it possible for our users to navigate to a special billing portal to be able to manage their subscription. For right now, we just want to make, we've already made the products link functional. We also want to make the link, the sign out div rather, functional when we click on it. So we don't need to log session, but what we can do is create a sign out function, which will just use Supabase client. Make sure once again that you're using Supabase client and not importing the Supabase from the index.js file. So make sure you're always on the client calling use Supabase client using that hook. And we can say Supabase client.auth.signout. And this returns a promise, but since we're not doing anything after it, we don't really need to. We don't need to redirect anywhere. We can just write it like this and not await it. And we can add an on-click to sign out so that when we have a session, we see our different navigation. But if we hit sign out, our session's removed and we see our old navigation items. Since we logged out, I'm going to briefly log in again. And the last item within our new nav menu, our new nav bar, to make functional is this billing link. The last API route that we need to create for our project is this manage billing endpoint. And just as we learned within navbar how to manage our session with the use session hook and use user hook, in manage billing and in any API route for that matter, we can use a special function. If we go to the server client example, we can use a special function called create server Supabase client. And this comes from the Next.js auth helpers. So in manage billing, we want to know, we are assuming that we're having a logged in user. Users will only be able to click on this link if they're logged in, and we need access to their session. The reason for that is within this API route, we need to know who the current user is, because we need to give the correct user, that is the current user, their particular billing portal. We'll import create server Supabase client, and this is written in TypeScript, but we can copy where create server Supabase client is called, and we can just say, we can just call this function and within an object pass in the request and response. We get back a created Supabase server client, and we can use that to get the current user. So we call Supabase server client.auth.getUser. It returns an object where it has a data property and on it a user property which we can destructure so we can get the user directly. In the case of our API endpoint, we want to say if we don't have a user, if not user, we want to return early and say res.status 401, and that status code means unauthorized. We can also send the text unauthorized. But if we do have a user, we can await Supabase server client, and say from profile, we want to select just the Stripe customer ID. We want to make sure that the user ID column is equal to the ID from user.id, and we want to get back a single record. We're going to get back an object where we can grab the data property and give it the alias profile. And that allows us to say await Stripe.billing portal. So we'll need to import Stripe.billing portal sessions create. So just like we created a checkout session, we're creating a billing portal session, and we need to provide the customer ID from profile.stripe customer ID and the return URL once they're done managing their billing. And we want to set that simply to site URL and just take them to the home page. Once again, when we're creating a session, we need to put it in a session variable, and then we're going to send it to the client with res send. This time we're going to add a URL property set to session.url. And we're going to make a request like we did with our checkout endpoint. We're going to make a request using a function which we'll name onManageBilling. It'll be an async function. We're going to call it when a user clicks on our link. And in the body, we're going to once again await fetch. You don't need to import this. This is globally provided since we're using Next.js. We want to import site URL /API /manage billing. We're going to get back a response. We want to await response.json, put it in a data variable, and then this time, instead of using a Stripe, bringing in Stripe on the client and calling a specific method, we can navigate to an external URL by using window.location.href is equal to data.url. And of course, we want to do that only if we actually do get back data. So we can say if data. Now we can test this out by clicking on billing and seeing that we are successfully navigated to billing.stripe. And here we can update our information. We can delete our payment method. And we can, more importantly, configure in our Stripe dashboard. If we look at the billing portal, if we go to settings, billing, customer portal, we can decide each setting, meaning if we want to allow users to switch plans, to cancel their subscriptions, and when they can cancel it, how they can provide their information, what fields to provide. So this is again the benefit of using Stripe and Stripe Checkout. It gives you so much to customize, so much control over your billing portal. And as you can see, all that we really needed to do was write a few lines of code. And then when a user wants to go back, they can click on return and they'll be taken back to the home page. Now, the last major feature of our app that we've really left for the end is enabling our paying customers to see the premium content. So naturally, we're just displaying the same stuff to our paying users versus our non-paying users. We need to fix this, and we can do this if we create a new table in our database. We can go to the table editor, and we want to make a new table, and this is going to be called product content. And this is going to be linked to each individual product, so we'll need to set up a relationship. But overall, this is going to be a very simple table. Within our columns, we just want to add the premium, the locked content that we only want our paying customers to access. So this could be a video URL. This could be a download URL for any type of asset. You know, it could be video, audio. It could be private training. It could be a link to something. It really could be just about anything. It could be access to a course, access to additional software. It could be access to a game, something downloadable. In our case, with my limited imagination, I'm going to include a video URL for the couple of courses that we have, as well as an option for a download URL in the case of a book. So these are both going to be null because we will choose one or another, or we could choose all of them if we wanted to. And both of these are going to be of type text, video URL and download URL. And we're also going to need to add a relationship between product content and our product, but it's not going to be set up here. This is what we technically call a foreign key relation. It's what we did between profile and the auth users table. We're going to save this for now, and once that's added, we can set up a relationship between the product to connect it to its protected content. So we're going to edit the table, edit the product table, and we're going to add a column that's going to be called product content ID. We're going to set up a foreign key relation, again on the public schema, to the new table that we just created. We want to connect it to the ID column. If a reference row is removed, we don't need to do anything, but we might want to raise an error, or we might want to set it to null. It's up to you whether you want to be able to delete this reference or not. What's going to happen if the underlying product content row is deleted? what's going to happen to the product itself. You probably don't want the product deleted, but that's just me. We'll hit save, and then we want to update and add that new column. And I've also included some seed data in productcontent.sql. These reference a few externally hosted videos, YouTube videos, and then one local download URL, again in the assets folder. I would also explore, I chose not to use it for this course, but you certainly could use Supabase storage to create a bucket, although I think just about any type of storage would suffice. S3 storage, whatever you might have an interest in. You might, if you have a hosted video or something like that, you might have some service in mind. Again, this Saas it's totally up to whatever content you want to host or sell on it. But if you really want to lock down the content and make sure it's only given to very specific people, you might want to use Supabase storage, but I don't have such strict demands for the premium content here. You can copy the product content SQL, and we can go to our SQL editor and we can run this. So we can add immediately, we can populate it with 3 new rows in product content. And the only thing that we need to do is go into product and link these. So we can just click on this product content ID, and for web design, if we click on this, we can select the web design book. For the front-end bootcamp, we want to select that one that starts with WG for the video ID, and then the last one, the remaining one, is for the Blender course. So now we've got associated product content for each of our products. We've got premium content, and in the next step, we'll see how within our individual product pages to correctly display that premium content to our paying users. Now, to display our product content associated with each product in our database, we need to go to the individual product page, and we need to write some code in order to fetch that premium content. So let's go into source, products, source pages, products, slug, and we're going to bring in Supabase client. So we'll use Supabase client, and to fetch our product content on the client, we want to perform an effect. So we'll bring in the use effect hook, and we'll include Supabase client as a dependency because we'll be using it in the effect function. And here is where we want to create a function called get product content. And for this async function to work within use effect, we need to include it within the effect function and then call it just like this. But here is where we're going to write some code in order to fetch the product content associated with a product based off of its ID. For this, we can await Supabase client. We'll select the product content table. We'll select all of it, all of the columns for each row, and we want to find the product content where the ID is equal to the ID that is on product.product content ID. And we just want to get a single record. Once again, we're going to get our data property, and we're going to alias that as product content. And once we have that, we can then put it in state so we can display it within our JSX. So we'll create some state with a default value of null. We'll name it product content setter set product content, and so we'll call that function, pass in the data that we're getting from Supabase, and we should, if we log it, be getting the appropriate content displayed for each product that we're looking at. So let me refresh, and we see for our web design book, we're getting the reference to download to the download URL. Now we want to display a link, or we want to overlay the actual content in front of this promo. We don't want our paying users to see the promo. So in my implementation, instead of the image, we're first going to check and see whether we have the product content, and if so, display it over the image. So for a download, if we have some downloadable asset like a PDF, and you can see the actual PDF in the public folder in assets. To make that possible to download, within the product wrap div, we're going to add a conditional and say product content, and we're going to use the optional chaining operator to make sure that this object actually exists and we're not trying to get a property off of null, which would throw an error. We want to say product content question mark download URL, and we want to return a set of anchor tags where the href is set to /assets, and then once again include product content. Optional chaining, well actually we don't need optional chaining here, dot download URL, and we have the file extension in the download URL. Add the attribute download, so it triggers one when the user clicks on this link, and the class is download link and large button. And within it there'll be a span with the text download and the class large button text. So we can now see this download button. If we click on it, we can see that it wants to save the PDF to our desktop. And as for our other products, the course, we can do something similar if product content contains a video URL. So we can add another conditional here, this time around the image itself, and say if we have a video URL, we want to return the React player. So React player is just a third-party video and audio player. We can import that, and this will easily play any link to a YouTube video. We can add some controls and set the URL to, once again, product content dot video URL. And now this will be displayed immediately instead of the image, and it can actually be played. And the last step to take within this particular page is that we no longer need to show the purchase link. So we can add a conditional, this time based off of the session. So we can call use session up at the top, see that our user's logged in, and that means that they've purchased a product or canceled a product at least. And we can add a conditional here around promo card and say, if we have a session, we want to return a subscriber card. Now this is a component that we can import from our products folder, subscriber card. We haven't built that out yet. This will be quick to make. This is just going to consist of a section with a div inside, which will contain an h4 that has the text see all products. We'll expand that, and underneath an h4 we'll have another paragraph that'll have the font size 1 rem with the text go back to see the entire catalog. This is just going to be a back button to see all of the products instead of taking our user to the purchase page, to the pricing page, which they obviously don't need to do. We'll add a link, and this will take users to just /products. We could also include a billing link here. It's really up to you what you want to include, what you think is most effective. We just don't need to show the pricing link again. And this link is also going to have the classes primary and button, and it'll have the text back to products. So we'll save that. We'll save the product page, and now we can see a link to see all products. If we go back, choose another course, we can see that course is loaded as well. There's one last problem that we have to take care of before we can consider deploying our app, and that is if we sign out, the issue here is that we still see the paid content. We're showing paid content to unauthorized, unpaying users. The way to fix this is through something called row level security. If we go to our README, we can take a look at the Supabase documentation, and it gives us authorization rules that are particularly important when we're accessing stuff on the client, or anywhere for that matter. If we don't have any RLS set up, you might have seen this warning, this table is publicly readable and writable. There's no way that we can deploy our application in this state, so we need to really think about what actions do we want to be possible for each of our tables? What level of access do we want our users to have? This is something that row level security specifies. We allow certain actions and disallow the rest, or allow certain things to happen only under certain conditions. And these policies, these can be written in SQL. We're going to write some really basic SQL to set these up, but they can be very granular, very precise, And these are ultimately very powerful and are identical to Firebase security rules if you've worked with those before. It's essential when we're working with a backend as a service like this, where we're able to do stuff like update our database from the client. We need to lock it down in some way, and that's what row-level security provides. So again, going back and thinking really about what we want to allow our users to do, it becomes pretty clear. There's not a whole lot that's allowed in the app, but for example, for our products, we don't want to allow our users to do anything with them. We really just want them to read the products. We're totally fine with all the product data being public. It's just the product content that isn't. So to set up RLS, we need to go to the product table. We'll start with that. We want to click on Enable Row Level Security. We'll click on Enable RLS and confirm it. And we need to create a new policy. We can use an existing policy, or we can start from scratch. If we click on the Get Started Quickly, there are some convenient templates here, and you can see what a policy would consist of to some extent, although it might be a little bit intimidating to look at. We're just going to create a new policy and choose for full customization. And we want to give our policy a name. In the case of our product, this will be very simple. We just want to say, allow read or select access to all users or to everyone. Let me rewrite that. This should be something like enable read access for all users. What I wrote really didn't make sense. We want the operation to be select. You can see here all the options. These correspond to all the core CRUD operations: create, read, update, and delete. We just want select or read to be the allowed operation. We can of course still change values within our admin on the back end. If we wanted to be able to create an admin section where certain users could create or update or delete different products within the application, we would add different policies for different operations. But for right now, select is just fine. We don't need to target any roles. As it says, it defaults to all roles if none selected. So that applies to anonymous and authenticated users. And we just want to say true. Give access to all. To do so, we just need to return true. This is what our SQL needs to return. It needs to return true or false based off of some condition. Since there's no condition and we want to allow access to everyone, we just make it true. We can hit review, can take one final look at our policy and hit save. So now it's no longer possible for anyone on our site anywhere, if they were to have our keys, unless they have our service role key, to make changes to our products. Now let's go back to our table editor and then navigate to Profile. We want to enable row level security. Make sure that you have that enabled first. Then we get to create a policy. We want to create this from scratch again. And generally, we don't have the concept of a public profile. We just want to make it possible for users to select their own data, their own profile. We don't need to share that with anyone else, not at this point. So we can add a policy that says users can select their own profiles. Again, we're not going to allow them to make any changes, so we want to choose select. And we want, in this case, for the role to be authenticated, we want it just to apply to authenticated users. Obviously, we don't want unauthenticated users or anon users to be able to access profiles. That doesn't make sense in the context of our app. And this expression, again, this has to evaluate to a true or false value. We can add a set of parentheses and just compare auth.uid. This is a function. This is laid out in the row level security page. There's a couple of special functions, auth.uid, and this is of type UUID, so a random string. This corresponds to our user ID column. We can use this special function, and there's an auth.jwt function as well. We want to check and see if auth.uid is equal to the authenticated user's user ID column. So we can specify directly their column, a column that is on profile. And if that's true, they can then view their own profile. We'll review this policy, save it, and then finally we'll go to product content, add row level security, add a new policy. And in this case, we want to lock down what we saw at the beginning, where only subscribed users can access the paid product content. So we're going to add a policy name, subscribed users can access product content. This is for select. It's going to apply to authenticated users, and this is going to be a far more complex conditional. We want to just select one column from, we want to select just one row from the profile table where the currently authenticated user's user ID is equal to profile.user ID. So we can select other tables as well, and profile.subscription status equals active. And we want to wrap all of this in exists, and that within another set of parentheses. So to review it, we're looking for a row from the profile table where the currently authenticated user's user ID is equal to the user ID column, and the subscription status is equal to the string active, and we're just wrapping that in exists to get a true or false value. So now we can hit review, save policy, and we can now confirm that if we attempt as an unauthenticated user to access paid content, we get a 406 error. If we look at our network tab, we can see specifically what that error is, and we look at the response, and we see results contain 0 rows, but if we log in and attempt to access the same product, and most importantly, confirm that the currently logged in user, if we go to our table editor, has the subscription status active instead of canceled. This is really important. If they have that active status, only then can they see the content. Now that we have a fully featured SaaS app, we're ready to deploy it to the world. And for this, we're going to use Vercel. So make sure you go to vercel.com and create a free account. Right now I'm logged in on my dashboard. And make sure that you also have a free GitHub account at github.com. I personally recommend creating a Vercel account with your existing GitHub account. It makes things a lot easier to remember how to log in. But once you've done that, we want to create a new repository just by going to github.com/new or hitting the plus button up at the top and selecting new repository. Now, make sure that you have Git installed on your computer. You probably already do. But if you haven't gotten Git set up with GitHub on your computer before, make sure to go to this URL. It's a really convenient guide to setting up Git and GitHub. And the reason that we need Git and GitHub set up is that whenever we use Git to make changes to our code, and Git is traditionally used for keeping track of changes that we make to our code through what are called commits. Whenever we take a commit and push it to GitHub, Vercel is going to automatically deploy those changes for us. So once you've followed all these steps and you have Git and GitHub set up, we can go ahead to create a repository. I'm going to name mine Epic SaaS. You can make it public or private, and then hit create repository. After you've done that, you'll be given all the instructions that you need to create a new repository through the command line. And I'm just going to copy this command, git remote add origin, and go to our project. Make sure to stop our development server and then run git init. And running that command will initialize Git in our project. After that, we want to add all of our files. But before we do that, I would recommend removing the PSD files in our assets folder because these are pretty big and these are just for your convenience, so you can either delete them or move them outside of our project. I'm just going to go ahead and do that quickly right now. It takes a while to add all these files, so that's just something to be aware of. After doing that, we can run git add, and we include a period to say add all files. Then we want to write a commit with git commit-m. And then we write a message, such as the message initial, since this is our first commit. And after that, we can copy the git remote to add a remote origin, hit enter, and then run git push -u origin main. So it might take some time to do this operation of writing objects to add all of our different assets, push all those assets to GitHub, but once that's done, we can head over to Vercel and select add new project. From here, we can import the repository that we just created with a specific name. We're going to use the default framework preset or the detected framework preset of Next.js, the same root directory that it specifies. No different build or output settings. We just need to add the environment variables from our .env.local file. So if we go to that, we can just select and copy all of those values and paste them in here. Just if we select the first input, all those should be populated, and then we can hit deploy. And I got a small error in my deployment. It told me on my success page that I need to fix this unescaped entity. So I'll go to success.js and fix that. And that's this apostrophe here. So if I replace it with this, and once again, run git add, git commit, fixes success page, then run git push, and go back to Vercel. We can go back to the home page to our dashboard and go to deployments, and we see that it's being built again with that new commit. We can take a look at the logs, and after a minute or so, it looks like everything was deployed successfully. We see status ready, and if we go to our domain, we see our Saas app that's running perfectly. So thanks again for taking this course. I hope you really enjoyed making this Saas project. Our app is fully functional. We can now accept customers. Feel free to customize it for your own use case, for your own personal interest or business interest. Add it to your portfolio, show it off. I hope you learned a ton in this course about Next.js, Stripe, Supabase, and now you feel confident building different projects with this stack of tools. So thanks again for taking this course, and I hope to see you in the next epic project.